Dear viewers, behind every mansion's gates there are stories that money cannot silence. Stories of secrets buried deep, of promises made long ago, and of pride that almost destroyed everything. In the Robinson mansion, a single moment changed the life of a father, a daughter, and the man he thought was just a driver. It began with an innocent dance, a little girl in a wheelchair smiling for the first time in months. But what looked like joy to her looked like betrayal to her father. What followed exposed hidden truths, a forgotten promise, and a shocking connection that no one could have imagined. Stay with me, because before this story ends, hearts will be broken, pride will be shattered, and the truth about love, prejudice, and forgiveness will leave you breathless. Stop that immediately! Edward Robinson's voice thundered through the marble halls of the Robinson mansion, echoing against the high ceilings like rolling thunder. He stood frozen at the entrance of the vast living room, his sharp suit still perfect from work, but his fists were clenched with fury. In the center of the polished floor sat Jessica, his 8-year-old daughter, in her wheelchair. For the first time in 6 months since the terrible accident, her face was glowing with pure joy. She clapped her little hands to a rhythm that carried life back into her fragile frame. Beside her was Pedro Costa, the driver Edward had hired only 3 weeks ago. The man's phone played soft Brazilian music, and with one hand holding Jessica's gently, he moved around her chair in a slow, careful dance. His steps were light, graceful, and his dark eyes carried a softness that matched Jessica's wide smile. But to Edward, it was an outrage. His chest tightened with anger as the sight burned through him. A billionaire father who had spent fortunes on the best doctors and therapists stood there, powerless, watching a simple driver succeed where all others had failed. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my daughter?" Edward roared, storming forward. The music didn't stop immediately, but Pedro quickly released Jessica's hand and raised his palms in a peaceful gesture. Jessica's smile crumbled at once, replaced with tears trembling at the corners of her eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, a silence that carried the weight of pain, misunderstanding, and something Edward could not yet name. The house went still after Edward's shout. The music from Pedro's phone cut off. Air hung heavy, like the mansion held its breath. Jessica's hands fell to her lap. A minute ago, she was laughing. Now tears filled her eyes. Pedro kept his palms raised. "Mr. Robinson, please. I was helping her feel the beat. It's safe. It gives her hope." Edward's jaw went hard. "You were hired to drive, not to do this. It's training. Music and movement help the brain learn." Jessica turned toward her father. "Daddy, I like it. My arms feel free when he helps me." Pride pressed on his tongue. "You are in a wheelchair, Jessica. The sooner you accept that, the better." Silence. Pedro lowered his hands. His eyes held no anger, only a quiet knowing, like he had seen this hurt before. "May I speak with you in private?" he asked. "There is nothing to discuss. Get your things. You're fired." Jessica gasped. "No, Daddy, please." Pedro looked at her and gave a steady, gentle smile. "Little one, remember the butterflies. Some fly in a different way, but they still fly." He touched his chest, then turned and left with calm steps that unsettled Edward. Jessica cried harder. "Why did you send him away? He makes me feel normal." Edward knelt and wiped her cheeks. "I am protecting you." "From what?" she asked. He had no answer. Fear had lived in him since the accident. Fear of hope that might break again. Lucy, the nurse, came from the hall. "Is everything all right?" Edward said. "We're fine," though nothing was fine. "Please, take Jessica to her room." "I want Pedro," she whispered. Lucy looked to Edward. He nodded. "Help her rest." As the wheelchair rolled away, Jessica stared at the door where Pedro had gone. Her lips moved without sound. Edward knew the words. Butterflies still fly. Alone now, he stood in the large quiet. On a side table sat the small speaker Pedro had used last week to teach clap and reach. Next to it lay Jessica's drawing of a bright blue butterfly. He picked up the paper. The lines shook, but were bold. He tried to hold the sound of her laugh in his mind. It stayed. So did Pedro's calm face. Samuel, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "Sir, the car is ready for your meeting." "Cancel it." "The investors." "Tomorrow." Cancel." Samuel nodded and left. Edward walked to the window. Outside, the driver's spot was empty. The sight bothered him more than he wished. Why had Pedro not begged? Why had he not argued? Why did his leaving feel planned? Questions followed Edward up the stairs to Jessica's room. He peeked in. Lucy was helping her change. Jessica's face was to the wall. "I'll come back later," Edward said softly. In his office, the numbers on his screen blurred. His mind kept replaying the slow steps around the wheelchair. He opened his laptop and searched music movement therapy, children, wheelchair. He skimmed simple lines about rhythm, learning, balance. He closed the lid and stared at his car keys. Without thinking, he went down to the garage. The garage smelled of rubber and cold metal. Pedro's bay was neat. A folded cloth lay on the bench. On the front seat of the car sat a small leather folder, as if waiting. He opened the door and picked it up. The leather edges were worn. Inside were printed pages, handwritten notes, diagrams. At the top of many pages were the letters J.R., Jessica Robinson. He sat and read. The notes were simple and careful. Start with clap and reach, slow beat, watch breath. Drawings showed arm paths, timing for turn and counter-turn, ways to keep joy while staying safe. One line read, "Joy keeps the door open for work." His throat tightened.
Near the back was a plan with dates. Week 1, rhythm in arms and shoulders. Week 2, trunk balance with sway. Week 3, gentle assisted turn. Each step had small boxes checked in pencil. Today's date was checked. He turned another page and found a photo, old and a bit faded. A young man in a white coat stood beside a woman in a hospital bed. Both smiled. The woman's blue eyes were Jessica's eyes. "Hannah," Edward whispered. It was his wife, years ago, in London. On the back, a neat note, Royal Free Hospital, London. Dr. Pedro Costa, pediatric neurology consult, with patient Hannah Robinson. Edward stared at the words, Dr. Pedro Costa, not driver, doctor. He looked through the folder again. On the last page lay a short note to him, written by hand. "Mr. Robinson, if you found this, I failed to explain with words. I did not come to take your place. I came to keep a promise to a mother who asked me to help her child if the day ever came. Music with movement can help the brain learn new paths, but the strongest path is the one that ties Jessica to you. Your presence is the medicine no one else can give. Pedro." Edward closed his eyes. He saw Jessica smile as the music played and the way it died when he shouted. He saw Pedro's steady hands and soft voice. He felt the long months of fear that had turned his heart hard. He opened his eyes and looked again at the photo. Hannah's tired smile held trust, not fear. Trust in someone he had just thrown out. Edward slid the folder under his arm and headed upstairs. He paused at Jessica's door. The room was dim. Lucy sat in a chair reading. Jessica's small face lay turned to the side, lashes still wet. "Is she asleep?" he asked. Lucy nodded. "She cried until she was tired, sir." "Thank you," he said. "I'll sit with her." Lucy rose and slipped out. Edward took the chair by the bed. He watched Jessica's chest rise and fall. On the nightstand lay the blue butterfly drawing, edges curled. He placed his hand on the paper. "Some fly differently, but they still fly." His voice shook. "I'm sorry." He did not yet know what to do in the morning. He only knew one thing. Fear could not be the one raising his child. In the quiet room, the mansion felt smaller, closer to human. Edward stayed there until his eyes grew heavy, holding the folder like a map he needed to learn to read. Outside, night pressed softly against the windows, asking him to choose courage over fear. The morning light crept into Jessica's room, through the curtains. Edward sat in the chair beside her bed, the leather folder still pressed to his chest. He hadn't slept much, only dozed in and out, haunted by the picture of Hannah and Pedro at the hospital. When Jessica stirred, her little eyes blinked open, still red from crying. She turned her face away when she saw her father. "Good morning, sweetheart," Edward said softly. Jessica didn't answer. He tried again. "Do you want breakfast?" Her voice was flat. "I'm not hungry." Lucy enters quietly with a tray, porridge, fruit, tea. She set it down and gave Edward a worried look. "Please, Jess," Edward said, lifting the spoon. "Just a little." Jessica shook her head and pulled the blanket over her face. Lucy whispered, "She refused to eat all day yesterday, too." Edward set the spoon down, his chest heavy. He knew she was shutting herself away. He had seen it before, after the accident, but this time it was worse. Downstairs, Samuel waited with his tablet. "Sir, the physical therapist just called. Jessica refused again. They can't do anything unless she cooperates." Edward rubbed his forehead. "Cancel all my meetings today." "Sir, the Japanese investors?" "Cancel them," Edward snapped. His voice softened a second later. "Family comes first." Samuel nodded, but lingered. "Sir, about Pedro." Edward looked up. "What about him?" "I ran some checks. I thought you should know." "He's not just a driver." Edward froze. "Go on." Samuel tapped his tablet. "Pedro Costa, graduate of King's College London, PhD in neuroscience, specialized in pediatric therapy. He worked at Royal Free Hospital for 6 years. Edward's stomach twisted. The photo in the folder had already told him, but hearing Samuel confirm it made the truth heavier. "There's more," Samuel said. "He lost his daughter 3 years ago, Gabriella Costa. She died in a car accident. She was only 5. Edward gripped the edge of his desk. He could almost feel Pedro's calm face staring back at him, a man who knew grief, a man who understood children in pain. "Why didn't he say any of this when I hired him?" Edward muttered. "Maybe he thought you wouldn't listen," Samuel said carefully. Edward remembered Pedro's words. "Men like you don't hire ex-doctors, you hire drivers." The truth stung. By afternoon, Jessica was worse. She wouldn't come out of her room. She wouldn't eat. She just stared at the butterfly drawing on her nightstand. Dr. Evans Williams came to examine her. After a while, he sighed. "Physically, she's fine, but emotionally, she's shutting down. Sometimes children attach themselves strongly to one person after trauma. If that bond is broken, they lose the will to fight." Edward frowned. "You're telling me she's sick because I fired a driver?" Dr. Evans shook his head. "I'm saying you underestimated his importance." Edward had no reply. He stood in the doorway long after the doctor left, listening to Jessica whisper into her pillow, "Butterflies still fly." That night, Edward returned to his office and pulled the folder from his drawer. He flipped through the notes again. Every page spoke of Pedro's knowledge, but also of his care. The handwriting was neat, careful, as if each word had been written with love.
At the bottom of one page, Edward noticed something new he hadn't read before. Patient must feel joy. Healing begins with laughter, not steps. His throat tightened. He remembered Jessica's laugh, the one that broke when he shouted. He reached for his phone. His fingers hovered, unsure. Finally, he dialed Pedro's number. The line rang several times before a calm voice answered. "I knew you would call," Pedro said. Edward swallowed. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because men like you don't hire doctors to drive cars. You hire drivers. And Jessica needed someone close, without expectations." Edward's anger flared, mixed with shame. "You lied to me. You manipulated your way into my home." "I made a promise to Hannah," Pedro said firmly. Edward's chest tightened. "What promise?" "6 months before the accident, your wife came to me at Royal Free. She was researching treatments in case Jessica ever faced problems. She asked me to promise that if anything ever happened, I would help her daughter in any way I could. That is why I came." Edward's breath caught. "No, Jessica was born healthy." "Yes," Pedro said softly. "But there was a genetic risk. Hannah knew. She didn't want to frighten you, so she kept it to herself, but she made me promise." Edward's knees weakened. He sank into his chair, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe this?" "It's in her will," Pedro said. "Look at page 17. She left instructions." Edward pulled up the digital file on his computer. His hands trembled as he scrolled, and there it was. "In the event of neurological trauma or paralysis involving our daughter Jessica, I recommend contacting Dr. Pedro Costa. His methods may seem unusual, but I trust him. He understands what our child may face. Please listen to him." The words blurred through Edward's tears. His wife had trusted Pedro, not him. She had left a path for Jessica's healing, and he had ignored it. "Why didn't you give me this letter before?" Edward whispered. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. You had to see Jessica smile first. Now you know it was real." At that moment, Lucy's frantic voice broke through from upstairs. "Mr. Robinson, come quick!" Edward dropped the phone and ran up the stairs. He found Lucy near Jessica's room, her face pale. "She's out of bed. She refuses to stop." Edward rushed inside. Jessica was standing against her wheelchair, her small hands gripping the armrest. Sweat rolled down her face, tears in her eyes. Her legs shook violently, but she was trying to take a step. "Jessica!" Edward cried. "Stop! You'll hurt yourself!" "No!" she shouted back, her voice breaking. "I have to show Pedro that I didn't give up!" Edward froze. His daughter, who had refused to eat, refused to speak, was now fighting with every ounce of strength just to move. For Pedro, not for him. He reached to grab her, but she raised her hand weakly. "Don't! I can do it! I have to show him I didn't give up!" Her legs gave way and she collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Edward dropped to his knees beside her, his heart aching. "Please," she whispered, gripping his sleeve, "bring him back." Tears filled Edward's eyes. For once, in the years, the billionaire who thought money could buy every answer had none. He held her hand and whispered, "I will." That night, Edward drove alone across London. The city lights blurred past, but his mind was clear. He had made a mistake that no amount of money could fix. He had let pride blind him, and it had cost his daughter her joy. When he reached Pedro's small apartment, he climbed the steps with the folder in hand. Pedro was on the balcony, reading a book in French, calm as ever. "You planned this," he said harshly. "From the start." Pedro closed the book and gestured to a chair. "Sit, Mr. Robinson. We need to talk as two men who love the same child." Edward's voice cracked with anger. "You lied about who you were. You used my wife's memory to force your way in." Pedro's eyes narrowed. "No, I kept the promise she made me swear on her deathbed. She knew you would fight it. She told me you would not believe in what you cannot control. That is why I came." Edward threw the folder on the table. "I know about Gabriella, about your daughter, about how you're trying to heal other children because you lost her." Pedro's face twitched, pain flickering across his features, but his voice stayed firm. "Every child I help brings her back for a moment, but don't mistake my grief for weakness. My love for Jessica is real." Edward's anger cracked into sorrow. He lowered his head. "Then tell me what you want from me." Pedro leaned forward. "I want you to stop controlling Jessica's healing. I want you to admit you don't have the answers. And I want you to apologize, not to me, but to her." Edward's eyes burned with tears. For once, he couldn't argue. And for the first time, he wanted to listen. Edward sat frozen in the chair across from Pedro. The night air was cool on the balcony, but sweat dampened his neck. For once in his life, he felt smaller than the man sitting opposite him. Not because of money, not because of status, but because of truth. Pedro's calm gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Robinson, Jessica doesn't need more doctors. She doesn't need more equipment. She needs her father. She needs you to believe in her, even when her legs don't move. That is where her strength will come from." Edward's lips trembled. "I don't know how to be that man. I don't know how to be the man Hannah expected me to be." Pedro reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded letter, yellow with age. He slid it across the table. "She knew this day would come. Hannah gave me this. She told me to give it to you only when you were ready." Edward's hands shook as he opened it. His wife's handwriting leapt from the page.
"Edward, if you are reading this, it means our daughter needs Pedro, and you are fighting it. Stop trying to fix Jessica with money. Stop letting pride blind you. Love her as she is, not as you wish her to be. Let Pedro help. He lost his daughter, but he can save ours." Tears blurred the words. Edward's chest heaved, and for the first time in years, he wept without shame. "Why didn't you give me this before?" he asked hoarsely.
"Because you would have torn it apart," Pedro said simply. "You needed to see Jessica's smile again first. Now you know it was real." Edward buried his face in his hands. His pride, his arrogance, his prejudice, it all sat heavy on his shoulders. Then his phone rang. It was Lucy. Her voice shook. "Mr. Robinson, you need to come home. Jessica is refusing to sleep. She says she won't rest until Pedro comes back." Edward looked at Pedro. The man said nothing, only waited. "Come with me," he pleaded. Pedro's answer was steady. "Not as your driver, as your daughter's doctor, as the man your wife trusted." Edward nodded through his tears. "Yes, as her doctor. As family, if you'll let it be that." The ride back to Robinson Mansion was silent except for the sound of the road. Edward glanced at Pedro in the passenger seat. For the first time, he saw not a driver, not a stranger, but a man who carried both pain and hope. When they entered the mansion, Lucy met them in the hall, frantic. "She's in the corridor! She won't stop!" Edward rushed ahead. There was Jessica, gripping the arms of her wheelchair, forcing her shaky legs to move. Sweat drenched her hair, tears streaked her face, but her eyes burned with determination. "Jessica!" Edward cried. "Stop! You'll hurt yourself!" "No, I have to show Pedro I didn't give up!" Her small body collapsed back into the chair, her chest heaving. Pedro knelt in front of her, his voice calm and tender. "Little butterfly, you don't have to hurt yourself to prove anything to me. I always knew you were brave." Jessica's tears slowed, her tiny voice cracked. "Will you come back?" Pedro looked at Edward. The billionaire's heart broke. For the first time, he understood it wasn't about pride. It was about his daughter's joy. He fell to his knees beside her. "Jessica, I'm sorry. I should never have sent him away. I let my pride get in the way. But I promise you now, Pedro will stay. Not as a driver, but as the doctor your mother trusted. And I'll be here too. Not just as your father, but as your partner. We'll do this together." Jessica's small arms wrapped around his neck. "Thank you, Daddy." Pedro's eyes softened. For the first time in months, Edward saw hope reflected back at him. The weeks that followed were different. Pedro worked closely with Jessica, guiding her through music and movement therapy. He used drums, clapping, even laughter as tools. The mansion, once silent, filled with rhythm and song. Edward stayed close. At first awkward, he slowly joined in. One afternoon, Pedro handed him Jessica's hand during a session. "She needs her father to dance with her." Edward hesitated, then took her hand. Together they swayed gently to the music. Jessica laughed, the sound bright and free. Edward realized then that healing wasn't about walking, it was about joy. Every small step mattered. Jessica's arms grew stronger. Her balance improved. Eventually, with Pedro's guidance, she took a few shaky steps with crutches. Each step was celebrated not as a miracle of medicine, but as a miracle of courage. 2 years later, the Robinson Mansion was no longer the same. It had become home to the Different Butterflies Project, founded by Edward Robinson and Dr. Pedro Costa. The halls that once echoed with silence now rang with music, laughter, and the clatter of wheelchairs moving in rhythm. Jessica, now 10, walked with crutches, her smile brighter than ever. She often helped other children during therapy, encouraging them with the same words Pedro once gave her. "Some butterflies fly differently, but they still fly." At the project's first graduation ceremony, 23 children completed the program. Parents filled the hall, clapping through tears as their children danced, rolled, or clapped along. Jessica stood on stage, her crutches steady under her arms. She looked out at the crowd and spoke into the microphone. 2 years ago, I thought I would never be happy again. But I learned that being different doesn't mean you're less special. It means you fly in your own way, and flying is beautiful. The audience erupted in applause. Edward sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Pedro clapped with pride. When reporters asked Edward about the project, he spoke openly. "I almost destroyed my daughter's only chance of happiness because of my pride and prejudice. I judged an extraordinary man by his skin, by his job title, and by my own fears. I was wrong, and I want the world to know it." Some of Edward's old friends distanced themselves, unable to accept his partnership with Pedro. But Edward no longer cared. He had gained something money could not buy, a true family and a purpose beyond wealth. Pedro published his methods freely, refusing to profit from them. Doctors across the world began using his approach, helping thousands of children. Gabriella's name was remembered in every child he helped, her short life becoming a light for others. One evening after the graduation, Edward stood on the balcony of the mansion. Jessica played the drums with other children in the hall below. Pedro joined him, quiet. "Thank you," Edward said. "You didn't just save Jessica, you saved me." Pedro shook his head. "No, you chose to change. That saved you." Edward smiled faintly. "Hannah was right. I needed you, and I needed to let go of myself." Pedro placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we both kept our promises." They stood in silence, listening to the music rise from below. In that moment, Edward knew the truth. The strongest medicine in the world was not money, nor power, nor even science. It was love, shared without pride or prejudice. And in that mansion once cold and empty, love had finally made home.